Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed the morning. For those of you who were not with us, you missed an action-packed morning, really powerful, encouraging, thought-provoking conversation, and we intend to continue that this afternoon. This afternoon, we have our Black Equity panel, and I'm really pleased to introduce the moderator for this panel, Kimahli Powell. Nice to see you, Kimahli, who I work with closely at the Foundation for Black Communities. And as you move into this conversation, I really encourage you all to think about what seems to be a reoccurring theme about the role of our ancestors and those who have come before us in guiding our steps as we move forward and continue to take on some really challenging, difficult work and do so not alone. And also really think about how we center power and make our spaces as inclusive as possible for all Black communities. And I think that's a really good thing to think about as we move into this conversation on equity. So Kimahli, thank you so much, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gladys. Hello, everyone. My name is Kimahli Powell. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Rainbow Railroad. Rainbow Railroad is an international organization based in Canada, the United States, and our mission is to provide solutions and pathways to safety for LGBTQI plus people at risk. And our organization has not only helped over 2,000 people resettle to multiple countries, including Canada, but also in doing so has had to advocate for safe spaces for an underrepresented community. And so the context of that work, this June, after years of advocacy, we received at Rainbow Railroad a landmark partnership with the government of Canada that will allow refugees to enter that country. It was that advocacy and the public policy that led to that announcement is a backdrop to which I'm really thrilled to moderate this conversation. This plenary, and also, of course, I'm a proud member of the board of directors for the Foundation of Black Communities, and really pleased to be invited to moderate this panel. Today's plenary focuses on what it means to reimagine social policy and how it's created, and highlighting the ways that governments and civil societies throughout Canada have sometimes not always been able to live up to expectations for its Black citizens. And we want to talk about how, as Black leaders in social policy, we're navigating the change in the social policy process. I'm really thrilled to do that with some really fantastic panelists. You know what, I'm just gonna let my panelists introduce themselves really quickly. And I'm gonna do it by kicking off with Debbie. Introduce yourself, and my first question to you is, how you doing?
Hi everyone. My name is Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah. I use she, her pronouns. Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, which is Canada's national 2S LGBTQ youth org. That's a good question on how do I do it. I don't know. I try every day, but I think I do it kind of pulling from experiences I've gained in my personal and professional life. And so to give you some context, I'm coming into this conversation as the proud queer woman and child of immigrant parents from Ghana. I'm trained as a policy analyst and has worked as a campaigner where I have promoted social equity policy for women and marginalized folks. And I'm also now an executive director of a national org that seeks to center queer and trans youth at any policy table we can be in. And so I do it with the spirit and support of a lovely team of young queer and trans folks and with a really lovely community.
Thanks, Debbie. I actually said how you doing, but I actually like how you do it better. So I'm gonna stick with this. I'm gonna stick with this. Njeri, how you do it?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for just having me on this panel. I'm quite excited actually, and just to be part of the conversation. And first of all, I just want to do a shout out to Tyler, who the last time I saw was in 2017 in Kenya. So excited to see your name on the panel. So Well, first of all, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Njeri Kontulahti, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am actually coming to you from British Columbia. It's a rainy day today, and I am a settler. I I am in the traditional territories of the. Are you guys getting an echo? A little bit. I don't know why. Maybe somebody can mute themselves, maybe because it. Yeah. Anyway, I am coming to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Tawasen, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, and Katzie First Nations, and I am just so privileged and so happy that to be welcome to this land, and that doesn't mean that we are still not facing racism as Black people, but just that gratitude. Starting with that gratitude as we are going through Reconciliation Week, I think is really what I want to start the conversation with. How do I do it? I am right now. I'm managing director of homelessness and housing with the Vancity Community Foundation. I just got this role in August, but I had been with Vancity Credit Union, who are the ones that formed the Community Foundation for 26 years, and when I was at the credit union, I really had access to a lot of our funding, our granting. So I was able, within my own purview, to be able to support organizations that I felt really strongly about, Black-led organizations. After 2020, we realized we were barely granting any money to Black-led organizations. And from 2020, we became very, very intentional. We came from less than 1% of our granting to close to 40% of our granting. So pretty much whatever is within my control, that is where I am able to do something. And so just a quick introduction.
Thank you. Funke, I want to make sure I pronounce your name properly. How are you doing?
It was good. That's good. Pronunciation is good. So I go by Funke, Funky, Funk, whatever you call me, depending on the color of the day. It's all good. Just make sure you call something or say something and you come talk to me. That's how I roll. But thank you so much. I'm glad to be back on the panel. I was here last year with Debbie. Shout out to Debbie. We had so much fun last year and I'm hoping to have fun today again. So I am the principal consultant and CEO of Hexagon Wellness Solutions, but I'm the outgoing ED of the Ribbon Rouge Foundation. It's a non-profit organization that deals with health equity and social justice for African, Caribbean, and Black folks in Alberta. And of course, I'm coming to you from 36 territory. And going back to what Njeri was saying, just going through TRC week, TRC festivities. I've been thinking a lot this week about doing and seeking equity on Indigenous lands and what does that mean to ACB folks who, and I'm hoping we get to some of that today as well in the conversation. I am also the president of the Nigerian Canadian Association of Edmonton, and Nigerians are the largest ACB community in Edmonton and of course in Alberta as well. So that keeps me quite busy. How do I do it and wearing all of these hats? I just always go to what is life-giving, and I find conversations in spaces like this life-giving. So I find it a privilege to be part of these conversations because they're life-giving and not a lot of things. And we all know for most of us who are leaders or activists or advocates in this space, we often don't see a lot of things that are life-giving. So when I encounter them, I often embrace them and embrace the people who are in those spaces as well. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to an amazing conversation.
Tyler, same question.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Tyler Boyce, and I'm the executive director of the Enchanté network. We are Canada's largest network of 2S LGBTQI+ organizations. We represent just around 200 organizations in every province and territory with one clear goal, and that is to leverage public policy and capacity building for a brighter future for all of us. First of all, I just really want to thank Gladys and her team for inviting me to this conversation with such a star-studded panel. I won't take up too much time because I really want us to jump into social policy for our communities. But how I do it is really alongside and in step with each of you. So I think you'll see on this panel kind of that power of collective action, and I'm really excited for it. So thanks again.
So let's jump into it. I should also note that I am generally based in Toronto, currently in Ottawa. Sorry, Debbie, I won't get to see you while I'm here because I fly out later. But certainly in Ottawa, in the Algonquin territory. And I actually am still kind of processing another panel that I was in at the Imagine Canada Summit. And it's interesting in the backdrop about being with my colleagues and friends on this call, having been on a panel with Senator Ratna Onavar talking about the charitable sector in a room of mostly white folk. And I think it leads to the really important dialogue that we're having, particularly around social policy, right? Because in that space, while I was invited guests, there weren't many Black leaders in that space talking about how the sector advances policy. But let's talk about how we do it in this space. Tyler, I want to come and start with you. And there's 5 themes that I want to kind of track in the short time we have. Consultation, feedback, leadership, data, and power. And so let's talk with consultation. How are Black perspectives being integrated into the consultation process for social policy development? Particularly, noting our realities of consultation fatigue and tokenism. Tyler, we'll start with you. What does meaningful engagement look like? And I wonder if you could share your experiences at Enchanté. Some people listening may not know that Canada has a federal 2S LGBTQI+ action plan. That's a federal document that mandates policy for the communities across the country. And such an integrative document that mandates all of government towards an agenda for our communities is huge, right? Talk about your experience about the consultation process and how it intersects with our conversation here about social policy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Kimahli and I are both coming as a very small handful of Black leaders at the Imagine Canada Summit that's happening at the same time. So I'm super excited to dive into this very authentic space with all of you. Consultation. So consultation within our communities, we know that there's consultation fatigue, but for me, consultation comes down to one word, and that is trust. As one of the youngest executive directors of a national organization of this size in Canada, I know that a lot of the ways that I do this work will be different than the work that was done before me, primarily because there is no one who is Black, queer, young, in roles like this today, and not very many who came before me. So when we're talking about consultation, I know what it's like to be on the side of the table where an organization comes to you and asks you a bunch of questions, really asks you to open up a very vulnerable piece of yourself and goes and does nothing with that. The clearest way for us to see that practice is to look at the data that comes out of consultation practices. I want to name it collecting stories about Black people and not sharing the data back with Black people is a white supremacist tactic of suppressing our stories. When Kimahli brought up the federal 2S LGBTQI+ action plan. It's the first ever in the country, and Enchanté really led that work as the national convener of queer and trans civil society in the country. When we did consultation for that work, we were able to galvanize one of the most successful response rates in the history of the Department of Canadian Heritage, where the LGBTQ2 Secretariat was housed at the time. More than 15,000 Canadians took their time to respond to this survey, and thousands of those Canadians were Black folks. When we look now at the data that was shared back with communities, almost 4 years later, we still only have a little bit about Black, queer, and trans folks in the country. What that tells me is that we still have so much work to do when it comes to the teams who are picking and choosing which parts of our stories get to make it into informing the bigger picture. So the way that we create policy, just to quickly finish, the way that we create policy, social policy especially, has to start with a very transparent, accountable set of principles and promises from the organization to our communities about what we're getting from this. But it can't just be our stories in a room of whiteness and whiteness deciding which parts of our identity get to make it into the bigger picture of public policy.
Funke, I see you nodding. I want you to chime in here. Tell us your perspective from within Alberta.
Thank you, Tyler, for starting us off. And I really like you started using trust and you ended off using transparency. I think the key is transparency. On Saturday, I was at a community consultation, another engagement, and at least 3 people told me, I'm tired of being used. So folks are using the word used at this point, excuse me, which is disheartening for leaders to hear. And it's because people are not, one individual actually said, for example, this consultation was done 4 years ago. We had nothing about it. And all of a sudden we're in a room talking about similar issues. What's happened in 4 years? So maybe the government has been working. So I think even communication is key as well. When you take people's stories, when you have to periodically let them know what's happening. Sometimes there's changes, there's stages of government politics happening that stalls certain processes and restarts them or kicks them in a different direction. But we need to be able to communicate with people. These are people with real lives, but we can't just say, okay, we're starting all over again, and this is where we're starting. Also, transparency. I really like that word, because without transparency, there can be no trust. So how can we be transparent enough? Someone said, oh, we're doing this consultation. At the end of the consultation, you know what? And they're like, we've heard that people want castles in the sky, but actually maybe all we can offer is a hut by the sea. I'm like, why don't you tell them that? Why are you setting these expectations for them to share their stories? And like you said, Tyler, at the end of the day, it comes out as just one little piece of themselves people see. Be transparent, be honest, be clear about expectations so people know what they're getting into, and then they decide how and why and if they would participate in the process. So that at the end of the day, once they've participated, they know what they're getting into, and with the hopes that, okay, there's certain outcomes they're looking for. Sometimes we know what the outcomes we want for social policy, but we're not communicating those clearly, and we're not being transparent to those who are participating. At the end of the day, people are feeling used. People are feeling tired. I can't believe I'm still hearing that. We touched on this last year, and I can't believe I'm still hearing that. And it was disheartening for me as a community leader 2 days ago when I heard that.
So I know I laid out 5 themes. I'm going to sprinkle decolonization on all the themes here. Because in Njeri, I think, the need for communication, engagement, and trust, as Tyler and Funke laid out, is part of kind of combating what is essentially a colonial process, right? What does it mean for governments to kind of already decide on the process for consultation before they reach out to Black communities with the script already and the process and the already mapped out? So how do we combat that when it comes to social policy from your experience?
I think just being part of the process is so important, because nothing worse than being told what to do when you are never there originally to be part of that process. I know this. I know right now in BC, there's been a lot of quite a bit of consultation around, this being the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent. It's all, of course, it's ending in 2024. So there's been a lot of urgent action for people to support a permanent legislative policy for Black Canadians. What does that actually mean? It means having a seat at the table. So when things like these are being set up, we have a voice from the very beginning. What I've always found very, very difficult is getting people engaged in something that's already been decided. So I'm really hoping we'll see something come out of this. There's been a lot of meetings. We were in one last week. where people are really rallying around this to have something actually happen. Because it's been 10 years, we're just about to come to the end of it, and nothing has happened in the 10 years that UNIPAD was set up. I hope I answered your question. I'm just
You did. I think how do we get informed in the consultation process, right? I think part of it is being in the room to help shape the process. And Debbie, I know that your work intersects multiple communities, but one that I'm most fascinated by for this conversation is around what it means to work with youth who, and in particularly Black youth in social policy, who it's easy to patronize through a process of consultation. What's your take?
That's a really good question. And I just wanted to say thank you for asking it, especially in the context of what Tyler mentioned. And I think it's important to note that my organization, CCGSD, is a proud member of the Enchanté network. And so when it comes to consulting young people to help inform LGBTQ policy nationally, specifically Black youth, it's been an interesting process. And the way in which our organization does it is through meaningful relationships with Black serving organizations that focus on young people, whether they are LGBTQ or not, but then also through other relationships, because Black folks that are young will show up in different organizations and spaces depending on what's available to them. Doing this work from a leadership perspective for me has been a priority since I joined the organization. And I say this as someone who I'm 31 now, so I'm no longer a youth according to the federal government. But when I was, I didn't have those opportunities to feel like I was being consulted. And so now that I'm in this role, I'm able to ask different questions. I'm able to get information in the hands of grassroots organizations in particular that serve Black people, and to get information that's meaningful to the right decision makers. It gets it on their desk. It helps inform, hopefully, direct policy or funding changes. And so it has been an interesting process. And I think it's important to note, in considering what's happening in Canada right now, and considering my organization's mandate, where education is a very huge institution that we navigate, at this current moment, when there is a pushback on queer and trans rights within school spaces across the country, engaging young Black, queer and trans folks has been a major priority, and speaking to their experiences has been a major priority, considering the ways in which, and I will place it on a, from an intersectional perspective, how that nuance on the experiences of people who are both Black, young, and queer go missing, but also get weaponized against each other. And so that's been really key too, is to kind of name those experiences. And one of the things that we're even thinking as an organization is, where's the opportunity for a youth-centric campaign where young folks can out loud say what they want to the people who are making decisions, and as adults help steward that, and so that the right decisions are being made, and that those who do face the most challenges are the most directly impacted. And so it's been interesting from a leadership perspective, getting young people's voices heard, especially young Black folks. But I think it's important to give credit to work that is currently happening, again, on Enchanté Networks, Back to Our Roots program, I hope I'm referring to that correctly, is laying the foundation for a national 2S LGBTQ organization that centers Black people. And with CCGSD being a member, with my leadership at CCGSD, and not only just mine, we have Black staff members from the management level to other levels in the organization as well, everyone under the age of 32, being able to ensure that the spaces that Enchanté Network creates also has young Black voices heard. And so through partnership and leadership, this is how we're making it happen.
I want to jump to feedback, because I think that's part of we have good notes around how to inform the consultation process. But I think, as Black folks in this space, we mostly interface around being able to give feedback within a process. And Njeri, I want to let's talk about housing. It's especially at a moment we need to acknowledge that We're in a national housing crisis. I want to say personally that Rainbow Railroad's office in an organization that deals with refugees and supports refugees is right across the street in Toronto from the Fred Victor Center. And so literally like across the street from the encampments. And I have to, one of the things I'm proud of is the response from Black communities who stepped in when the city and the province and federal government could not in the days around finding housing solutions for refugees who are Black and brown mostly. And I also have to give a shout out to the Foundation for Black Communities who stepped up and provide resources and all the other grassroots organizing. Mm-hmm. That's how we do it. And that's how we provide support to our communities. And yet, you know, I could just imagine at this moment, you know, I don't know if our voices are there in the consultation process around how to deal with the housing crisis, even though we act. Soapbox aside, let's get to the question. You know, what does it mean, folks, to provide real feedback when it comes to social policy? And what dynamics are needed to give feedback when social policy are not working? Particularly when critiquing policy that is not working for Black folks while still advocating for the necessity of those Black folks. And Njeri, I really want your take on it from dealing with the housing perspective, and particular around your work in Vancity.
Yeah, you know, we all know that everyone deserves safe and affordable, you know, a place to call home. But we all know that systemic racism and discrimination is a reality, especially for Black Canadians. And how do we really get that out there, that this is happening? I mean, we see it in the news. I don't know, you remember there was this story of this girl that went and tried to get an apartment, and on the phone, because she sounded white, the apartment was available. But by the time she got to the place, immediately the apartment was not. And then when she sent her friend, who's white, they were told, oh, the apartment is still available. How do we get that kind of information out there? Because it's, as Tyler said, it's the stories that will move the dial. But also, we need to have those stories out there. That feedback loop, when I think about even data, the type of data that we need to be collecting that really goes to the root of systemic racism. That's the kind of information that we need out there, because when you have that information, you're able to move the dial on so much. But it is, as we know, when it's a challenge for housing right now for everybody. As I said, I'm in this new role, and so I'm navigating it. But I am seeing the challenges that racialized and racialized people are seeing when they're trying to find housing. So how to give feedback is actually having facts and data. I think that's what's going to really help that conversation going, because you can't lie about data. You can't lie about real stories that you're hearing in the news. So I think that's kind of my take on how you can give that feedback. And that feedback actually gets something moving.
Is there meaningful opportunities for feedback from Black voices within the housing space? And how do you ensure there is?
You know, right now, I don't think there is, because we need to be a unified force. I think Tyler talked about that collective action that we need to be taking. I think this is the kind of issue that, as a community, a Black community, we should be getting together, maybe have a housing committee or something that will be that unified voice that we bring together to help move policy. I don't think we have that right now. And maybe I'm wrong, because in BC, we don't have a very huge Black population. Maybe in other places there is, and other people can chime in. But you really do need that unified voice to get anything done.
But that's a really important point, Njeri, and Funke, I want your experiences from Alberta, right? We talk about, I think people would say, if you were in the city of Toronto, that there might be more opportunities for inclusion for Black folks in housing policy, but we are having a national conversation here, and this looks different in different regions. And so, again, to you, Funke, as well, like, what does it mean to really have feedback within social policy, and in a time where you're not sometimes the only Black person in the room?
Yes, thank you so much, Tyler. I'm sorry, Kimahli. I think I've had to think about this critically recently. I'm going to use the housing that we're on as the example. When it comes to experiences of housing, houselessness, and homelessness, we first need to challenge the notion of lived experience versus living experience, even for ACB folks. Some of us have lived experience. Maybe we've had housing, homelessness challenges, but some people are actually living it. It's their reality. It hasn't been done. I'm going to use an example of COVID. Some people will say we've lived through COVID, and some people believe we're living through COVID. So having that multiple perspectives at the table is always important. I've had to think about that doing work in the HIV and STI space. When I mean sexually transmitted bloodborne infection, right? There's different experiences there. And sadly, sometimes most people who come to the table to inform housing policy and housing processes are maybe people who have had lived experience, not people who are having the living experience, because oftentimes because of barriers, those people may not be able to come to the table. So even the process of creating that policy, it's flawed, for lack of a better word, from the beginning, because the people who are informing it are people who maybe are talking about their lived experience that happened some 5-10 years ago, which may not match the living experience of those who are going through it right now. So I think that is a very important distinction for us to make, right? Even when we're thinking about this very collaborative, seamless process, housing is on a continuum, people. What on what part of that continuum do you fall? In Alberta, we're seeing a boost in a population because our housing market still seems to be stable. A lot of people are moving, secondary migration again. A lot of people are moving to Alberta because housing seems to be relatively more affordable than BC or Ontario, and our economy is booming. So we're also seeing that influx as well in Alberta, and it's something that we have to, conversations we have to have for ourselves. The last point I'll also make, I'm working on a housing research currently that is looking at what would a housing model look like for newcomers in Alberta? And we had to start from a place of what does a house mean versus what does a home mean? Again, even language in the process is also very vital and very important as well, because that shapes and frames the outcomes that we'll get out of the process.
Tyler, I want to continue on this track because I think, before I do that, Tyler, Njeri, you were thirsty to jump in.
I was just going to add that when Funke was talking, I thought about, like, we started a nonprofit. It's a Black-led nonprofit. It's for Black women. And we actually got funding last year to just focus on housing Black families. That's it. That was the whole premise of our nonprofit. So I think in our own small way, we are trying to do something, and this is a federal funding that we got. So I just thought I would add that in, that when Funke was talking about the lived experience and the living experience, I was thinking, yeah, I had that lived experience maybe 10 years ago, but we are seeing that living experience right now, and that's what we are working with our nonprofit. But it's only just geared towards Black families and Black individuals.
Tyler, I want to jump on this point around lived experience, because it's occurring to me as we talk about feedback. I think it's important for all of us to check ourselves, right? We're talking about what it means to be at the table and from social policy. But even that, to Funke, your very important point, having worked in the HIV space and in the migrant space, talking about what it means to center ourselves on lived experience, is that these tables are elitist. And even having this conversation as people who have the privilege to be in this space is elitist. Tyler, you represent a network of voices across the country. How do you combat that elitism when it comes to feedback? Because I think Funke's point is a really important one.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate like the question. Before I answer it, I also just want to acknowledge that something that's made me really happy in this conversation and very inspired in this conversation so far is the way that your questions and also the comments from my fellow panelists have really not homogenized the Black experience. We've heard about our experiences as being different, that we have something as a community to offer, not in one way, but in a multitude of ways. But to your question of how we challenge sort of elitism in these spaces, Kimahli, I think it's very tied to the tone and tenor of this conversation. It is to recognize that there are different ways for us to approach an issue. I don't think, and I see a lot of white-led organizations doing this, where you say, oh, lived experience. So you find someone going through what might be the most tough time in their life, and you say, well, you fix it because it's your lived experience. No, I think the way that I combat elitism through my leadership is to understand my role and my piece in that puzzle. My role is to be a conduit and a facilitator for those voices to be supported in the ways that they offer their experiences to a policy development process. Specifically, what that looks like is making sure that we just, every year the Enchanté Network hosts the largest conference of queer, trans, and allied leaders in the country. And it was just 2 weeks ago. My keynote, my plenary session panels were Black folks. And that was very, very intentional, because in those spaces, that's where you bring the lived experience. You don't bring the lived experience to plan the panel, to plan the conference. That's what we do to support and facilitate the work. But when it comes to the key conversations that we need to be having in policy spaces, philanthropic spaces, we make sure that lived experiences is there and loudest in those key moments. And that's how we push back on, you know, this even the concept of there being a divide between elitism and lived experience. Absolutely not. It's going to take all of us Black people coming together to figure out how we move forward, and that can't be in a divisive sort of framework.
So we talked about consultation, we talked about feedback, we talked about leadership. Now let's not pretend that this is going to be the only panel throughout this conference that talks about what it means to be the only Black voice in the room. I think that's going to be, I think it's a refrain that we all know, and that's going to be, that's a given experience that we know. But Debbie, I want to talk about leadership and how you deal with that dynamic in the social policy space. How do you amplify your voice from your perspective as a, still young Black queer woman leader who has to represent that voice in spaces where there are mostly white people at the table?
It's a really good question. And I think it kind of ties a lot to what Tyler just mentioned about being that kind of conduit connector role. And that's often the role I like to take up when I am in these spaces and I am the only Black person that is there, and sometimes also the only woman in those spaces too. And so that's also an interesting dynamic when we consider the ways in which misogynoir prevents Black women from entering those spaces and how we experience them at the same time. But that being said, when I am in those spaces, for me personally, I know the role I have being in that space to mention the things that usually other folks aren't going to. And oftentimes it's being that reminder that there are other considerations we need to have here. There are other questions we need to have here. Here's what this institution said about this issue. And bringing up the report that is maybe created by a grassroots organization that never has the chance to have the recommendations heard by, say the 2S LGBTQ Secretariat, for example, or the Minister of Education, for example. It's being in that space with, say, union leaders and being like, here's what's being said in this space by Black folks who are experiencing a challenge where parents who work overtime aren't actually able to attend parent-teacher interviews or be part of a parent committee. This is the type of role I like to have in these spaces. And oftentimes it also means that I might have to navigate with the biases and assumptions people might have when I try to assert myself and make sure that those things are said. And that's just something that I acknowledge. I will navigate myself, and maybe that's just a privilege as someone who has experienced this enough that I'm very comfortable with being uncomfortable. But it is a duty I take on myself, and obviously there's pressures with it. But I think it's an honor to be in those spaces. It's an honor to be able to speak from the multiple perspectives I have, but also to bring others that are in that space. And so that's what I try to do.
Funke, I'm going to lean into what Debbie just says, and I want us to get a little uncomfortable for a minute. Let's talk more about biases and assumptions as being Black leaders. And so it's only Black leaders in spaces where social policy is being discussed. What are we talking about?
Well, I think if I understand your question quite well, you're talking about us having biases as Black leaders.
I think the biases and assumptions that come with being the only Black leader in the space.
Oh, okay. I see what you mean. I think the issue with being a Black leader, oftentimes in white spaces, is the fact that you're often seen as speaking for the entire Black community. You're often seen as representing a whole. Whereas people, going back to Tyler's point, there's a lot of diversity within our community. People don't want to understand that. People just see you as, okay, Funke, you're in the room. Tell us what we should do for your people, right? I think that's a huge thing that oftentimes most of us need to navigate, right? Or assuming that I would subscribe to the same ideologies as everyone else in the room, or every Black person, every Black folk subscribes to the same ideologies as I do, just because I am Black, right? So I think it's what I have to walk through often, most times in my role as a leader, and also in Alberta, where there's days, for example, I have to figure out if I'm going to say harm reduction today or the reduction of harm, depending on the space I am, right? And what goes in that space. So even challenging some of the biases I have and even my values sometimes, and thinking through it when I'm in certain spaces is also critical as a leader, because I know oftentimes I have to speak for some people who may not have the privilege, like we're saying right now, to be in those spaces or to be afforded the opportunity to be in those spaces. So I often have to constantly, like Debbie said, be comfortable with the uncomfortable, knowing fully well that maybe the room has a certain idea of me, but also I'm standing and I am representing a whole group of people who are also counting on me as well.
And Njeri, similarly, right, to Funke's point, being the only Black person in a room talking about housing policy doesn't necessarily mean that you're being invited to talk about the Black experience for housing. You are there as an expert in that space talking about social policy. How do you intersect the two, right? The fact that you're not, even though you're the only Black person in the space, you're not necessarily there to only talk about the Black experience. You're there to move social policy forward.
Yes, it's true. When you're always the only Black person in the room, it is quite, first of all, it's challenging to get your voice heard, and just to get, challenging to get your voice heard, but also you really feel you have to represent the Black community. But I know my experience is really different from other Black people, because we're not a monolith, for sure. But the fact that you're in the room is really a big step that people really have, and people really stopping and listening to what you're saying is important. So having really good information around housing policy and then bringing in the Black experience is going to be very, very important when you're looking to move housing policy forward. Because people really look at housing in different ways. Is it rental? Is it ownership? But being in the room is one of the most important things because when you're there, you will actually point out the Black experience being a little bit very, very, very different from what everybody else is going through.
And so, we talked about consultation. We've talked, and in consultation, we also talked about data. We talked about feedback and leadership. As we wrap, and I can't believe how quickly we've passed through time, but I want to wrap by talking about power. And when we talk about power, I think this is where we need to talk about how these dynamics exist. and how social policy gets made in the first place, who mirror what having power looks like. And specifically, I want to talk about what power means for all Black people. And this is where I got to speak now, truth to power in the elevator of the room. It's just remarkable for me and a privilege for me, as I'm just going to name it, as a Black, cisgender, gay male running an LGBT plus organization, leading a dialogue in a Black space with other leaders, two of which also represent LGBTQ plus communities. And I think we just need to acknowledge that we still have ongoing work to do as Black communities to ensure our intersection with our community. And naming that out loud when we talk about social policy, Tyler, I really want you to speak to kind of, what does it mean, even when we talk about Black social policy for us as LGBTQ plus folks who have been traditionally marginalized within our own communities to have an equitable seat at the table. How can we reimagine equitable policy within our own Black community?
I really appreciate the kind of power behind that question. Let me put it in this way. When we go into spaces, there are certain immutable characteristics about us as Black people first and foremost. As a Black cisgendered queer guy, the first thing that people see is not necessarily the fact that I'm a gay man. The first thing that people see is the color of my skin. The first thing that our institutions see when I seek to access services in healthcare, housing, safety, policing, etc., will always be my Blackness. So I want us to first acknowledge that. The second piece I want folks in this discussion to acknowledge and to sit with a little bit is the fact that every Black, queer, or trans person that you know likely comes from a Black, or most of them come from a Black family. So we've already had these conversations at home, but also within our professional life. And the one key learning that in my experience has come from all of those moments has been that there is space right now, at this minute, at this moment, for us to not re-perpetuate the exact same dynamics that we're fighting against within our own communities. And that has been the foolproof way of getting folks to understand the power that we have as a community comes from the different experiences around the table. Black, queer, and trans folks, we know how to fight. We have been fighting. If you look at Black Lives Matter, which changed the trajectory of the world, it was started and led by two Black queer women. If you look at Black Lives Matter Toronto, who really changed the country, most of their core organizing group was Black queer people. So now we look at this moment and this opportunity that we have here with the Foundation for Black Communities and this resurgence of Black leadership in this space. We have a moment to reimagine what this space can look like for generations to come. Mm-hmm. We will not meet this moment if we only promote and amplify voices that look exactly like the white supremacist structures that we're pushing back against. So this moment of Kimahli being like an openly Black, queer person leading one of our largest nonprofits, working with queer and trans refugees internationally, me and Debbie being on this, it shouldn't be a moment of, wow, that's different. It should be a moment of, we're finally scratching past the surface of what we can do and achieve as a community when we amplify all of our lived experiences.
That's amazing. Community, engagement, trust. Debbie, they tell me that time's up, but I want you to have the last word. When it comes to social policy and Black communities and intersection, what's the last thing you want people to remember? You got 30 seconds.
People need to remember, when we make policy that focuses on the most marginalized people, it impacts everybody. When you only focus on those who have the most privilege in a community, that doesn't trickle down, folks. So when you center those who are often forgotten in policy making, the benefits are for everybody.
Debbie, Tyler, Funke, and Njeri, it's been an honor and a privilege to be with you in this panel. Please follow all of us on all the things to learn more about these great organizations, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for taking your time to speak with us. Thank you. Over to you, Gladys.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's so lovely to see you all and hear from you all. Thank you for such a great job moderating that conversation. Kimahli, I know it was hard to wrap it up. I personally would love to hear more, and I can't wait to continue the conversation with each of the panelists. And I encourage everyone else to do so in the next segment, which will be the brain dates. And so we'll encourage everyone to make their way over. Before you do, just a couple of things to think about. What I'm taking away from that panel in particular is really thinking about what underlies your approach to equity and advancing equity. Who have you welcomed to the table and how? Have you really done enough to make that a welcoming space, or have you simply opened the door and created a seat? What are you sharing in terms of stories, and how are you reporting back? And, you know, probably one of the biggest takeaways, but it's something we all know, but really need to make sure it's core to our work, is recognizing that the Black experience is not homogeneous. We have a responsibility, a shared responsibility, to make sure that we are creating space, making space for amplifying the voices of our community. And we're really proud to be able to do that through our work at FFBC and in partnership with you all. And so up next are much anticipated brain dates. For those of you who may not be familiar, brain dates are one of the most notable features of Future of Good summits. Over the past few years, brain dates have generated hundreds of connections and learning hours at the Black Leadership Summit, Black Leadership and Social Impact Summit. You get to learn from and share valuable knowledge on equity and justice from participants from across the country. We hope you've signed up for a brain date conversation, and we can't wait to see what comes out of these conversations. So with that, we'll let you all make your way over, and we will be back together around 3:25, if I'm not mistaken. Thanks, everyone, and see you all soon.